By morning, everyone in the Red Lantern Saloon would swear they had seen nothing until one cowboy made sure they could not. The rain had been striking the window since midnight, hard enough to turn the street outside into black mud and silver ripples beneath the oil lamps. Inside, the piano sat silent. The last card game had broken apart, and the smell of whiskey, wet wool, and cigar smoke clung to the walls like an old sin no one wanted to name. Margaret Maggie Rose Bennett stacked chipped glasses behind the bar with hands that refused to shake, though every instinct in her body told her to run. She was 24, white, chubby, with auburn brown hair pinned under a plain work bonnet and a blue calico dress faded from scrubbing floors before dawn. Victor Sloan, owner of the Red Lantern, had sent the bartender home early and told Maggie to finish closing. He said it was only 3 cattle buyers left, men with money, men who spent loud and tipped when pleased. But Cleet Danner had stopped being pleased an hour ago. He sat with one boot hooked around a chair leg, grinning over an empty glass, while Roy Pike and Amos Finch blocked the path between Maggie and the back door. "Saloon is closed," Maggie said, keeping the tray between herself and the room. Her voice stayed even. She had learned that fear fed certain men faster than whiskey. "Kitchen is cold, coffee is gone, and Mr. Sloan said no more service after midnight." Cleet dropped 3 coins onto the table one at a time. Each hit the wood like a dare. That sounds like a problem for a girl who wants to keep her job. Victor stood near the office door, pretending to count receipts. He did not look up. Maggie's fingers tightened around the tray rim. She thought of the debt ledger Victor kept locked away, the wages he said she still owed against her father's old account, the room fees she had never seen written plain, the weeks she had worked until her back ached and still been told she was behind. If she angered Cleet, Victor would add damages. If she stayed quiet, the men would push closer. Either way, the numbers would find her. Roy laughed and stepped into the aisle. "We are not asking for much." Maggie moved one careful step toward the front of the saloon, where the swinging doors breathed rain-cooled air whenever the wind pushed them open. Amos shifted to follow. Her heart beat once hard. The room had 5 witnesses besides Victor, a sleeping drummer in the corner, a stable boy collecting bottles, 2 miners near the stove, and an old card dealer with his hat over his eyes. Every one of them looked away. That was what nearly broke her. Not the men. The silence. Then the saloon doors swung wide, and rain swept across the floorboards behind Eli Carter. He stood in the doorway in a dark trail coat, black Stetson low, water running from the brim, his face weathered and still beneath the lamplight. His gray eyes took in Maggie, the tray in her hands, the men blocking the exits, Victor by the office, and every witness pretending not to witness. Eli stepped inside, turned, and drew both saloon doors closed behind him. Not to trap Maggie. Not to start a fight. To make the room answer for what it had seen. The latch settled with a clean wooden click that cut through the smoke. Cleet began to rise. Eli did not move toward him. He only placed himself between Maggie and the aisle, hands open at his sides, voice quiet enough that no one could mistake it for drunken noise. "Nobody leaves until the sheriff hears every name in this room." Maggie stared at the broad line of his shoulders, afraid to trust it, afraid not to. Eli looked back just once, not touching her, not claiming her, only making sure she could see that someone had finally turned toward the truth instead of away from it. Then he faced the room again and said, "You will never fight alone again." Cleet Danner's chair scraped backward, but the sound stopped before it became anything larger. Eli Carter had not raised a hand. That made the room more uneasy than shouting would have. A man looking for trouble could be met with trouble. A man standing still with clear eyes and a calm voice forced everyone to choose what they were willing to say they had seen. Maggie kept both hands on the tray, the wood edge pressed against her apron. Rain ticked against the windows. Somewhere near the stove, one of the miners shifted his boots, as if he had just remembered he owned a conscience. "You think you can lock us in?" Cleet asked, his grin thinning. Eli turned his head only enough to make the words land. "I closed the doors because every man in here watched what happened. They can walk out after they give the sheriff their names." Roy Pike gave a rough laugh and looked toward Victor Sloan. You letting him run your place now? Victor finally lifted his eyes from the office receipts. His face had the smooth annoyance of a man whose profit had been interrupted. Mr. Carter, this is my saloon. These gentlemen paid for the evening. Then you can afford to have the evening written down proper, Eli said. He looked at the stable boy, no older than 15, frozen near a crate of bottles. Son, go through the kitchen door and fetch Sheriff Bell. Tell him there are witnesses waiting at the Red Lantern. The boy glanced at Victor. Victor's jaw tightened. Maggie saw that look and knew what it meant. Wages docked, chores doubled, another line added in the debt ledger. Before fear could close around the boy, Eli added, I will speak for the errand if anyone questions why you ran it. The boy bolted through the kitchen. The back door slapped once, then the rain swallowed his footsteps. Cleet spread his hands as though amused. All this over a waitress being dramatic. Maggie felt the word hit, familiar and dirty. Dramatic. Difficult. Ungrateful. Men used those words when they wanted a woman to apologize for noticing the trap. Eli did not look at her, and somehow that helped. He did not make her fear the center of the room. He put the truth there instead. Her work does not make her available for disrespect, he said. And your money does not buy silence. The old card dealer slowly lifted his hat from his eyes. One of the miners muttered, he is right. It was barely a sentence, but Maggie heard it like a match struck in a cellar. Victor came out from behind the office desk. Let us not make this a county matter. Miss Bennet knows how rough cattlemen speak after whiskey. No harm has been done. Maggie's stomach clenched. No harm. That was how men like Victor survived. They named the harm too late, when it had already become a woman's burden to carry. Eli faced him fully. If no harm has been done, you will not mind the sheriff hearing that from her. Victor's eyes flicked to Maggie, and with that single look he reminded her of the ledger. Her father's old account. The room fee she had never agreed to pay. The meal charges for suppers she had cooked herself. The breakage fees for glasses cracked before she touched them. She had no family left in town, no savings except the few coins hidden in a flour tin, and no proof except what Victor locked in his office. If she spoke against him, she could lose her job before dawn. If she stayed silent, she would lose something harder to name. The saloon waited. Eli took one step sideways, widening the space between Maggie and the men near the table. He still did not touch her. Miss Bennet, he said, quiet enough that it felt meant only for her and still clear enough for the room to hear, you do not have to answer anyone but the sheriff. Not me. Not Sloane. Not them. Her fingers loosened a little on the tray. For the first time that night, the decision did not feel stolen. When Sheriff Thomas Bell arrived, rain dark on his coat and irritation in his gray mustache, the room rearranged itself around the badge. Cleet leaned back as if bored. Roy stared at the floor. Amos rubbed a hand over his mouth and said nothing. Victor began talking before the sheriff had removed his hat, calling it a misunderstanding, a late closing, a fume and too loud after a long drive. Sheriff Bell listened, then looked to Eli. You sent for me? The stable boy did, Eli said. I asked him to. Miss Bennet was closing alone. These men would not leave. Several people saw enough to say so. The sheriff turned to the room. Then we will start with names. One by one, he wrote them. The miners, the card dealer, the drummer roused from sleep, the stable boy when he returned dripping from the storm, Victor, Cleet, Roy, Amos, Eli. When the sheriff looked at Maggie, the pen paused above the page. Her mouth had gone dry. Victor stood very still near his office door. Maggie could almost hear the scratch of his ledger even with it locked away. Miss Bennet, Sheriff Bell said, more gently than she expected, do you wish to make a statement? Every eye came back to her. Eli's did not push. They simply waited. Maggie swallowed. I want to, she said, and the shame of not being able to say more burned behind her eyes. But I cannot tonight. Victor's shoulders eased by the smallest measure. Eli saw it. So did Maggie. The sheriff closed his notebook slowly. Then I will come back in the morning. Victor smiled again, already rebuilding control. But Maggie, reaching to smooth her apron with one trembling hand, felt paper crinkle in the pocket near her hip. She froze. A torn corner of ledger page, caught there sometime in the confusion, pressed against her fingers like a secret that had escaped its cage. The storm had softened to a cold drizzle by the time Sheriff Bell finished taking names and ordered the Red Lantern closed for the night. Victor Sloan protested in the polite voice he used when he wanted anger to look like business, but the sheriff only pointed toward the office door and told him the saloon could lose one evening of profit for the sake of county peace. Maggie kept the torn paper hidden in her apron pocket, her fingers resting over it, as if a scrap no larger than her palm could hold the weight of a life she had not been allowed to own. Cleet, Roy, and Amos stepped into the rain with sour looks and muttered jokes that died when Eli Carter turned his head. He still had not touched Maggie. Not when the men passed close, not when Victor tried to pull her aside, not when the sheriff asked whether she had somewhere safe to sleep. Eli only answered the question after Maggie looked at him, and even then he spoke to her, not over her. "Mrs. Clara Hensley keeps a boarding house 2 streets east," he said. "Respectable, locked rooms, widow with a tongue sharp enough to peel paint. If you want, I will walk on the far side of the road until you are inside." Maggie studied him under the saloon awning. Rain shone on his black Stetson and dark coat. His gray eyes were steady, but steadiness had fooled her before. Men could be calm when they believed gratitude was already owed to them. "And after that," she asked. "After that, you sleep behind a door that locks from your side. That is all you want?" Eli looked toward the muddy street, then back at her. "Only that tomorrow, the truth has more witnesses than fear." She wanted to believe him less than she wanted air. Belief was expensive. It asked a woman to loosen the hands she kept around herself, and Maggie had learned young that loosened hands could be filled with someone else's debt. Still, she could not return to the tiny room above the saloon, not with Victor counting every step she took and every breath she owed him. She nodded once. Eli walked beside her through Rose Hill with nearly 6 feet of rain-dark street between them. That space spoke louder than any promise. He did not offer an arm she had not asked for. He did not try to soften the night with talk. He only matched his pace to hers and stayed between her and the saloon's last yellow window until it vanished behind them. Mrs. Hensley opened her door in a gray wrapper, holding a lamp high enough to make her silver hair look like wire. She looked from Maggie's damp dress to Eli's soaked coat and immediately narrowed her eyes at him. "If this is trouble, Mr. Carter, it can sleep in the barn." "Trouble is back at the Red Lantern," Eli said. "Miss Bennett needs a room." Mrs. Hensley's expression shifted without softening. "Then Miss Bennett can have the blue room. You can have the porch until I decide whether you are worth coffee." For the first time all night, a corner of Maggie's mouth almost moved. Eli accepted the judgment with a dip of his head and paid for 1 week in advance, placing the coins on the hall table. Maggie stiffened. "I did not ask you to pay." "No," Eli said. "So it will be written as a loan only if you choose to call it one. If you do not, Mrs. Hensley can return it to me and put it on my account for bad coffee." Mrs. Hensley made a sound that might have been approval if anyone braver had named it. "The blue room locks from the inside," she told Maggie. "There is hot water in a pitcher and dry towels on the chair. No man enters my upstairs hall after sundown unless the house is on fire, and even then he had better knock." Maggie climbed the stairs with her apron gathered in one hand and the torn paper burning against her palm. Inside the blue room, she turned the key twice and stood with her back against the door until her breathing slowed. The room was small but clean, with a patchwork quilt, a washstand, and a window facing the alley where rain dripped from the eaves. She removed her apron carefully and drew out the torn page. The paper had ripped diagonally, but several lines remained clear beneath a smear of ink. "Bennett, Margaret Rose. Meal fee. Room fee. Breakage fee. Advance whiskey service." Maggie stared at the last line so long the words began to swim. She had never bought whiskey in her life. She had cooked meals she was later charged for, slept in a room above the saloon because Victor said no decent house would take a woman in debt, and paid for broken glasses she had swept up after customers left. But here, in Victor's own hand, was a charge so false it made every other number suddenly suspicious. Her fingers trembled, not with fear now, but with the first dangerous edge of understanding. She crossed to the small table, lit the lamp higher, and unfolded an old receipt she had kept hidden inside her sewing kit, a receipt from 3 months earlier when Victor had claimed her father's debt was nearly cleared. The total on the torn page was larger than it had been then. Larger, after 12 more weeks of wages withheld. Maggie sat down slowly. Outside, from the porch below, she heard Mrs. Hensley say something sharp about men who thought rescue excused dripping on floorboards. Eli answered too low for Maggie to catch. She looked again at the paper. The saloon had not only been a dangerous room that night. It had been a cage with numbers for bars. And by accident or providence, one of those bars had broken off in her pocket. Morning came with a pale strip of sun over Rose Hill and the smell of coffee rising from Mrs. Hensley's kitchen, but Maggie had not truly slept. She had spent hours at the little table in the blue room, the torn ledger page on one side, the old receipt on the other, moving her finger from number to number until the truth stood plain enough to frighten her. Victor Sloane had not merely miscounted. He had written a life around her with charges she could not see, then locked the book and called the lock honesty. When she came downstairs, Eli Carter was not in the parlor. That surprised her more than his presence would have. Mrs. Hensley set a plate of biscuits before Maggie and nodded toward the front window. He left at dawn. Said a woman ought not wake to a man waiting in the parlor as though he owned her next decision. Maggie looked out and saw only muddy wagon ruts, porch rails, and a wet street slowly returning to business. The empty space where Eli might have stood made something inside her loosen, cautiously. After breakfast, Sheriff Bell arrived to take her statement, and this time Maggie did not say she could not speak. She told him about the men refusing to leave, about Victor sending the bartender home, about the ledger and the charges she had never been allowed to inspect. She did not embellish. She did not make herself smaller. She placed the torn page and the old receipt on Mrs. Hensley's table and watched the sheriff's face change from patient concern to professional stillness. "You kept this receipt?" he asked. "It was the only proof I ever had that the debt was going down," Maggie said. "Except it was not, was it?" The sheriff folded both papers carefully. "Not according to this torn page." By noon, Eli returned with 3 things: a plain paper listing the names of 2 lawyers in the county seat, a note from Carter Ridge Ranch offering temporary kitchen work at fair wages, and a stage schedule west in case Maggie wanted to leave Rose Hill entirely. He placed them on the parlor table and stepped back. "Those are choices," he said, "not instructions." Maggie stood across from him with her hands clasped tightly at her waist. "And if I take the work at your ranch? You will be cookhouse help, paid every Saturday, with your wages recorded in a ledger you can read. You will sleep in the women's room off the kitchen until Mrs. Hensley or Sheriff Bell decides there is a better arrangement. You can leave anytime. And if I take the stage, I will drive you to the depot. And if I hire a lawyer, I will give your name to neither man unless you choose which one." She searched his face for pride, for expectation, for that hidden hook men sometimes buried under kindness. All she found was weariness around his eyes and patience that did not reach for her. "Why?" she asked. "Why give me all of this?" Eli looked down at his hat brim. "Because last night I saw 5 men become furniture when you needed witnesses. I have disliked that kind of silence a long time." It was not the whole answer. Maggie could hear the closed door in it. But she had closed doors of her own, and for once no one was forcing one open. She chose the ranch work before sunset. Not because Eli offered it, she told herself, but because the thought of returning to the Red Lantern made her chest tighten, and because wages written in a ledger she could see sounded like a kind of freedom. The next morning, Mrs. Hensley rode with her to Carter Ridge Ranch in a wagon borrowed from the livery, making it clear to every staring window that Maggie was not being hidden or carried off in shame. Eli rode ahead on horseback, never once looking back as if to check whether she was grateful. Carter Ridge Ranch spread beneath a wide Texas sky, all-weathered fences, low barns, live oaks, and pasture rolling gold beyond the cookhouse. The kitchen smelled of flour, coffee, bacon, and wood smoke. Maggie stood at the threshold with her carpet bag in one hand and the torn ledger page folded inside her bodice pocket, feeling as if she had stepped into a place where work could be honest if the people allowed it. The ranch cook, Mrs. June Talley, a square-shouldered widow with flour on her sleeve, handed Maggie an apron and pointed to a clean ledger on the shelf. Breakfast at 5. Supper at 6. Wages on Saturday. Complaints go in writing unless they are foolish, and then they go in the stove. By afternoon, Maggie had kneaded bread, counted pantry tins, and written her name beside a day's pay in ink that no one hid from her. When the kitchen settled after supper, she took out the torn page and her old receipt beneath. The lamplight. Mrs. Talley lent her a magnifying glass used for reading spice labels. Line by line, Maggie compared the numbers. Her breath caught when the final total revealed itself. Her father's old debt had been cleared 3 months ago. Every charge after that was a fence built from lies. She sat back slowly, flour still on her wrists, and stared at the proof. Outside, a lantern burned beside the back step Eli had repaired that afternoon without mentioning it. For the first time in years, Maggie was not only afraid of what Victor had done. She was ready to make him answer for it. The next week at Carter Ridge Ranch did not erase the red lantern, but it gave Maggie something she had not known how much she needed: mornings that began without dread. Before sunrise, the cookhouse filled with the smell of coffee, hot biscuits, frying bacon, and bread dough rising under clean cloth. Maggie learned the rhythm quickly. Flour first, then coffee beans, then pantry count, then breakfast plates lined along the long table for ranch hands who came in hungry and left their boots at the door because Mrs. June Talley would not tolerate mud where food was served. Nobody called Maggie girl. Nobody snapped fingers for service. The ranch hands called her Miss Bennett because Eli Carter had said it once at the first breakfast and then looked at every man in the room until the name settled properly. Maggie pretended not to notice. She noticed everything. On Saturday, Mrs. Talley opened the cookhouse ledger and counted Maggie's wages in front of her, every coin placed beside the written line. Maggie signed her name slowly, the ink dark and honest beneath her hand. There was no hidden page, no locked drawer, no voice telling her she still owed more than she could see. That night, she tucked the coins into a small cloth pouch and cried without sound behind the door of the women's room, not because she was broken, but because being paid fairly felt so unfamiliar it hurt. Eli kept his distance with a discipline that unsettled her in a different way. He knocked before entering the cookhouse, even when Mrs. Talley was there. He never stood too close behind Maggie at the pantry shelf. If he left coffee near the back step, he was gone before she opened the door. When the lower step cracked beneath a ranch hand's boot, Eli repaired it before supper, then walked away with the hammer still in his hand as if safety were ordinary maintenance and not a favor demanding gratitude. Maggie watched him through the window while she rinsed tin cups. She told herself she trusted the work, not the man. Yet the two were harder to separate each day. One evening, after the supper dishes were dried and Mrs. Talley had gone to inspect the smokehouse, Maggie found Eli outside the cookhouse hanging a lantern on a hook beside the path to the women's room. The pasture beyond him lay dark blue under a rising moon. "You do not have to keep fixing things around me," she said. Eli tested the lantern wick, then stepped back. "I fix things that should not have been left broken." "That sounds like a habit." "It is." She leaned against the door frame, arms folded, not quite ready to step into the yard. "Because of the silence you mentioned?" His hand stilled on the lantern frame. For a while, crickets carried the answer. "My sister Ruth worked at a boarding house in Abilene," he said at last. "A man with money made trouble for her. Not the kind that leaves marks people can count, the kind that leaves whispers people enjoy. I was on a cattle drive. By the time I came home, half the town had chosen comfort over truth. She left with a carpet bag and no apology from anyone." Maggie's throat tightened. "Did you find her?" "Years later. Married, safe, sharper than ever. But she never went back to that town, and I never forgot how many men watched her carry that bag." Eli looked toward the dark pasture. "That is why I closed the saloon doors. Not to frighten anyone. To keep them from escaping their own eyes." Maggie looked down at her hands, remembering the tray, the blocked aisle, the men who became furniture until Eli made their silence visible. "I thought help always came with a price." Sometimes it does. His voice was quiet. That is why you should inspect every offer, including mine. The honesty of that almost made her smile. Before she could answer, a rider came fast up the lane, dust pale behind him in the moonlight. It was Ben Harlan, one of the younger ranch hands, waving a folded paper. "Mr. Carter," he called, slowing near the cookhouse. They posted this outside the Red Lantern and another at the Mercantile. Eli took the paper, read it once, and his expression went cold in a way Maggie had never seen turned toward her. He handed it over without hiding it. The notice was written in Victor Sloane's clean, businesslike hand. Margaret Bennett abandoned lawful employment, left outstanding debt unpaid, and is not recommended for kitchen, household, or public-facing work. Maggie felt the cookhouse tilt around the edges. Beneath Victor's statement, in larger crooked letters, someone had added, "Ask the 3 cattle buyers what trouble she brings." Mrs. Tully came to the door, wiping her hands on a towel. "That man has less shame than a coyote in a henhouse." Eli folded his arms, but he did not reach for the notice. "Tell me what you want done with it," he said. Maggie looked at the paper, at the dark yard, at the lantern Eli had just hung so she would not have to cross the path blind. A week ago, she might have torn the notice to pieces and been called hysterical by morning. Now she saw the hook inside it. Victor wanted her angry in public. He wanted the town to watch her react instead of reading what he had written. She lifted her chin. "Nothing tonight." Eli waited. Maggie folded the notice carefully as she had folded the torn ledger page. "Tomorrow, we take this to Sheriff Bell. And this time, I will be the one who talks first." Morning found Rose Hill pretending the notice was only paper, but Maggie knew paper could cut deeper than a shouted insult when it was nailed where decent people passed on errands. The first copy hung outside the Red Lantern, its corners damp from night mist, Victor Sloane's neat handwriting dark against the board. The second copy had been fixed to the Mercantile Post, where women came for flour, nails, lamp oil, and reasons to talk. Maggie saw both from the wagon seat before she stepped down. Mrs. Tully sat beside her with her mouth pressed thin. Eli rode on horseback a few yards ahead. Not as a guard displaying ownership, but as a man willing to be counted among her witnesses. He had offered to drive by the back road. Maggie had refused. If Victor had written lies in public, she would answer them in daylight. The street slowed when she climbed from the wagon. A woman carrying a basket paused at the Mercantile door. 2 men near the water trough turned to look. Clete Danner leaned against the Red Lantern porch with Roy Pike and Amos Finch, all 3 trying to wear amusement-like clean shirts. Victor stood in the saloon doorway, arms folded, expression grave enough for a funeral he had arranged himself. Maggie felt every stare press at the seams of her blue work dress. Her body remembered the old instinct: lower your eyes, pass quickly, do not feed the talk. But the folded notice lay in her reticule beside the torn ledger page and the old receipt, and those papers gave her spine something straight to follow. Clete tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Leaving another job today, Miss Bennett?" Roy snickered. Amos looked away first. That surprised her. Not enough to forgive, but enough to notice. Eli reined his horse to a stop, but Maggie lifted one hand without looking at him. "Wait." He did. That single obedience steadied her more than any rescue. She walked to the Mercantile Post and read Victor's notice aloud, every word, so no one could pretend later that they had not known what they repeated. "Abandoned lawful employment," she said, her voice clear. "Outstanding debt unpaid. Not recommended for kitchen, household, or public-facing work." The street was quiet now. Even the horses seemed to chew softer. Maggie turned toward Victor. "You wrote that I owe you money." Victor's brows lifted with practiced sorrow. "I wrote the truth as my ledger records it." "Then bring the ledger." His expression changed so slightly that only someone who had served him coffee for years would have seen it. "Business records are private. Not when you use them to ruin a woman's work." A murmur moved through the people near the Mercantile. Victor's eyes sharpened. "Careful, Maggie. Temper will not help your reputation." There it was, the trap Eli had warned her about: react and be called unstable, stay quiet and be buried. Maggie folded the notice once, twice, and placed it back into her reticule. My temper is not the evidence. She turned from him before he could answer and walked toward Sheriff Bell's office. Each step felt longer than the last. The sheriff's office sat between the assay room and the livery, a narrow building with a flag limp in the damp morning air and a window streaked from last night's rain. Maggie could hear Eli's horse behind her, stopping at the hitching rail. He did not follow her inside until she glanced back and gave the smallest nod. Even then, he remained near the door while she approached the desk alone. Sheriff Bell looked up from a stack of county notices. His gaze moved from Maggie's face to the reticule clutched in her hands, then past her to Eli. Trouble again? Proof this time, Maggie said. Her voice did not shake. She laid out the notice first, smoothing the creases flat. Then the torn ledger page. Then the old receipt showing the debt nearly cleared 3 months before. From her pocket, she added the list of names taken at the Red Lantern: the miners, the old card dealer, the drummer, the stable boy, Victor, Cleet, Roy, Amos, Eli. Victor says I abandoned lawful employment. I say he kept me through a debt already paid. He says I owe him. I say the numbers changed when he thought no one would ever see them. Sheriff Bell removed his spectacles and leaned closer. Where did you get this torn page? It caught in my apron the night the saloon was closed for statements. And this receipt? Hidden because I did not trust his ledger. The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then turned the receipt toward the window light. Eli said nothing. The silence he offered was different from the silence in the saloon. It did not erase her. It made room. Maggie placed both hands on the desk. I am done paying for lies written in another man's hand. The sheriff sat back, his expression settling into the same official stillness she had seen once before. Then we will read the hand that wrote them, he said. He reached for his hat and badge coat. I am requesting Sloane's full ledger. Before sundown, and if he refuses, I will request it from the county judge. Mr. Carter, you stay available. Miss Bennett, you stay close. Outside, a bell on the livery door rang as someone entered, and through the sheriff office window Maggie saw Victor watching from across the street, his notice still nailed to the mercantile post. For the first time, he looked less like a man in control and more like one realizing paper could turn against him. Sheriff Bell did not give Victor Sloane until sundown after all. By mid-afternoon, he crossed the street with Maggie's torn ledger page in his coat pocket, Eli Carter walking 3 paces behind him and Maggie beside Mrs. Hensley beneath the mercantile awning. The notice still hung from the post, but fewer people stood near it now. Once a lie was being measured against paper, it no longer felt safe to repeat for pleasure. Victor saw the sheriff coming and met him at the saloon door with a smile too thin to be hospitality. Sheriff, if this concerns a private employment matter, I must insist that my business records are not street entertainment. Sheriff Bell stopped on the boardwalk. Then we will step inside and make it county business. Maggie watched Victor's fingers curl once against the doorframe before he opened the way. The Red Lantern looked smaller in daylight. Without music and smoke, its red curtains seemed tired, the table scarred, the floorboard stained by years of spilled drinks and swept-away excuses. The office door was locked. Victor produced the key slowly. Eli remained near the main room, close enough to witness, far enough not to crowd Maggie when Sheriff Bell asked whether she wished to enter the office. She did. The ledger lay on Victor's desk beneath a brass lamp, thick, brown, and familiar in the way a closed thing can haunt a person. Maggie had carried plates past that door for years, hearing pages turn inside while her own wages disappeared behind wood and brass. Now Sheriff Bell opened the book in front of her. The first pages were ordinary: whiskey orders, cardroom fees, supply accounts. Then came employee debts. Maggie saw her name and felt the room narrow. Bennett, Margaret Rose. Father's account transfer. Meal fee. Room fee. Breakage fee. Advance service charge. Uniform laundering. Late bookkeeping fee. She leaned closer. Late bookkeeping fee? Victor folded his arms. Administrative burden caused by irregular payment. Maggie looked at the sheriff. He kept my wages before I ever saw them. Sheriff Bell ran his finger down the column. And still charged you late. Eli's eyes lifted from the far wall, but he did not speak. The sheriff compared the ledger to the torn page, then to the receipt. The debt had been reduced to almost nothing by spring. 3 months later, after Maggie's wages should have cleared it, the balance grew again through added fees. Several were written in a slightly different shade of ink, squeezed into margins as if added after the lines were filled. "Who else writes in this ledger?" the sheriff asked. "Only me," Victor said, then corrected himself too quickly. "And occasionally the bartender, under my instruction." "Where's the bartender?" "Gone to Fort Worth on family business." Maggie remembered him being sent home early the night of the trouble. Her stomach tightened. Sheriff Bell turned another page and stopped. "Advance whiskey service," he read. "Miss Bennett, did you purchase whiskey from this establishment?" "No," Victor sighed. "It is a service designation, not personal consumption." Meaning? Meaning the saloon lost revenue when certain customers were not properly attended to. The words hung there, ugly in their neatness. Maggie understood then that Victor had charged her for refusing what no woman should have been forced to endure. Sheriff Bell closed the ledger halfway, one finger keeping the place. "I will be taking this book." Victor's face changed. "You will not. I will receipt it. That book contains private accounts and possible unlawful charges." Outside, voices gathered near the saloon windows. People had realized something was happening. Victor lowered his voice. "Be careful, Sheriff. A town with no saloon license fees has fewer funds for peacekeeping." Sheriff Bell looked at him over his spectacles. "A town that lets ledgers trap women has bigger troubles than fees." By late afternoon, the sheriff had taken statements from the stable boy, the 2 miners, the old car dealer, and the drummer who had slept through half the night but woken before Eli sent for help. The stable boy stood twisting his cap in both hands and admitted Victor had told him to leave early, then changed his mind and kept him collecting bottles in the back so the kitchen door would not be watched. One miner admitted he had seen Roy step into the aisle when Maggie tried to leave. The old car dealer said he had pretended to sleep because it was easier than standing up. He said that part with his eyes on the floor. Maggie listened to every word. None of it changed what had happened, but each statement moved the burden from her body onto the record where it belonged. Eli stood by the office wall, hat in hand. When Sheriff Bell asked him what he saw, Eli answered plainly, "I saw Miss Bennett closing alone. I saw 3 men refuse to leave. I saw men who should have spoken stay quiet. I closed the doors so the silence could be counted." No one laughed. Near sunset, Sheriff Bell walked to the town board and removed Victor's notice from the Mercantile Post himself. In its place, he pinned a county summons requiring Victor Sloan to bring the full ledger, wage records, and Red Lantern license papers to a public hearing in Town Square the next morning. He added the names of Cleet Danner, Roy Pike, and Amos Finch beneath it as required witnesses. Victor read the summons with a face gone hard as dried clay. Cleet, watching from the saloon steps, stopped smiling. Maggie stood beside the board, her hands cold but open now. The lie had been nailed there at dawn. By dusk, the town was reading something else. The town square filled slowly, not with celebration, but with the uneasy silence of people realizing they had to choose what kind of truth they were willing to stand near. By mid-morning, Rose Hill looked different. Not changed in its buildings or dust, but in the way people avoided eye contact with Victor Sloan as he crossed from the Red Lantern toward the courthouse steps. Sheriff Bell had ordered the hearing to be public, and that alone stripped the comfort from the usual rumors. Maggie Bennett arrived with Mrs. Hensley on one side and Sheriff Bell's deputy walking ahead to clear a path. Eli Carter rode in behind them, dismounting without haste, staying where he always stayed, close enough to witness, never close enough to claim. Maggie held nothing in her hands now except the folded summons and her own steady breath. The same hands that had once shaken behind a saloon counter now felt unfamiliar in their calm. Victor stood at the center of the square beside a table that had been dragged out from the courthouse. On it lay the Red Lantern ledger, the wage book, and the county seal. Cleet Danner lounged nearby with Roy Pike and Amos Finch, but their earlier confidence had thinned into something less certain, like dust after wind. Sheriff Bell called the hearing to order and read the charges plainly: disputed wages, falsified employment debt, refusal to produce accurate ledger records, and public defamation against a named employee. Victor stepped forward first. "My establishment maintains private accounts," he said. "I am being pressured to expose business matters in front of a town that does not understand bookkeeping." A few heads nodded automatically, out of habit more than agreement. Maggie stepped forward when Sheriff Bell looked at her. No one told her to speak. No one prevented her. That alone felt like standing in a different world. She unfolded the torn ledger page and placed it on the table. Then she placed the old receipt beside it. "My father's debt was cleared months ago," she said. Her voice did not rise, but it carried farther than she expected. "After that, new charges were added that I was never informed of and never agreed to." Victor exhaled through his nose. "Those are standard operational fees." Maggie turned toward him. "You charged me for meals I cooked myself." A murmur moved through the square. Sheriff Bell did not interrupt. Eli did not move. "You charged me for rooms I was told I had no choice but to occupy." She pointed to the ledger. "And you charged me for refusing something called advance service, which I never consented to and never received payment for." Roy Pike shifted his weight. "Amos." Finch looked at the ground. Clete Danner's expression lost its ease completely. Victor raised his voice slightly. "You were employed at my saloon." "Employment includes, then show the full wage record," Sheriff Bell said. "Not summaries. Not margins. The complete ledger." Victor hesitated. That hesitation lasted only a moment, but it was enough. The sheriff opened the book himself, page by page, while the town watched. As the ink became visible in daylight, the pattern emerged. Repeated charges added after wages were already deducted, identical fees copied across weeks, handwriting that shifted subtly in pressure and angle. The crowd grew quieter with each page turned. A man in the back muttered, "That ain't accounting." A woman near the mercantile whispered, "That's not right." Maggie felt something in her chest loosen that she had not known was still clenched. Victor tried once more. "These are clerical adjustments." Sheriff Bell closed the ledger halfway. "These are inconsistencies that will be reviewed by the county judge." Then he looked up. "And likely by the state licensing office." Victor's composure cracked at the edges. Clete pushed off the post he had been leaning against. "We were just drinking. Nobody got hurt." Maggie turned toward him. "You stood in front of me when I tried to leave." Her voice stayed level. "And you laughed." Clete had no answer ready for that version of events spoken plainly in daylight. Roy looked at him, then away. Amos shifted backward a step as if distance could rewrite memory. Sheriff Bell addressed the square. "Based on testimony and record discrepancies, Victor Sloan's saloon license is suspended pending full review. Wage records will be recalculated under county supervision. Any falsified debt entries will be voided." A sound passed through the town, not applause, not outrage, but the uneasy exhale of people realizing something had been real all along that they had treated as noise. Victor stared at the table where his ledger now lay open like evidence instead of authority. For the first time, he did not speak. Maggie looked at him but did not wait for him to respond. Instead, she turned slightly, enough to see Eli at the edge of the square. He had not stepped forward. He had not spoken in her place. He only met her eyes and gave a small nod, as if confirming that she had reached the part of the road he had always meant for her to walk herself. Sheriff Bell closed the hearing. "This matter is not finished," he said. "But it is no longer hidden." The crowd began to break apart in uneven clusters, carrying the story with them in different directions. Maggie did not move immediately. She stood at the edge of the table, where her name had been written and rewritten in ink she no longer feared. The saloon, the ledger, the silence that once surrounded her, it all felt suddenly like something that had already begun to lose its grip. And for the first time since she could remember, no one in the town was asking her to stand alone. By the end of that week, the Red Lantern no longer looked like the place that had once held Rose Hill by the throat. Its doors were shut under a county notice, its windows dark even at supper hour, and the red lamp above the entrance had been taken down by Sheriff Bell himself while half the town pretended not to watch. The county judge reviewed Victor Sloane's ledger in the sheriff office with Maggie's torn page, her old receipt, the wage book, and statements from every witness who had been named that first night. The decision came in writing, plain enough that even Victor could not polish it into misunderstanding. Maggie's employment debt was declared fully paid as of 3 months before the saloon incident. Every charge added after that date was voided. Victor was ordered to repay withheld wages, improper fees, and the cost of 1 week at Mrs. Hensley's boarding house. His saloon license was suspended for 6 months pending state review, and the county opened a formal complaint for falsified wage records. When Sheriff Bell read the order from the courthouse steps, Victor stood without his usual smile, hat in hand, while men who had once laughed at his tables turned away from meeting his eyes. Clete Danner, Roy Pike, and Amos Finch did not escape behind drunken excuses either. Sheriff Bell fined each of them for disorderly conduct, disturbing a closed business, and refusing to leave when told. The judge barred them from the Saloon district for the remainder of the season and assigned them to repair public boardwalks under town supervision, where every hammer stroke reminded Rosehill that loud men could be made useful when the law stopped calling their behavior harmless. Clete tried to make a joke on the first morning of the work order, but no one laughed. Roy kept his eyes low. Amos, who had looked away first at the hearing, sent a written apology to Maggie through Mrs. Hensley. Maggie read it once, folded it, and put it away without letting it decide anything for her. The larger apology came from the town itself, though not all at once. The mercantile owner removed Victor's notice from the wall and replaced it with Sheriff Bell's correction stating that Margaret Rose Bennett owed no lawful debt to the Red Lantern and had left employment under valid cause. Mrs. Hensley stood beside Maggie while the notice was posted, one hand on her cane, daring anyone to whisper. Maggie did not smile then. She simply read her own name on the paper and felt, for the first time in years, that ink could free as well as trap. 2 days later, at Carter Ridge Ranch, Eli found her in the cookhouse counting flour sacks and coffee tins as if the work could keep her from feeling too much. He set an envelope on the table. Sheriff Bell sent the first wage repayment, he said. Victor has until month's end for the rest. Maggie opened the envelope and counted the coins. Her hands were steady. I thought it would feel bigger. Justice? Eli asked. No, she said. Being believed. He did not answer too quickly. That was one of the things she trusted about him now. He let silence be a place to stand, not a place to hide. There is a stage leaving tomorrow for Fort Worth, he said at last. Mrs. Hensley says she will ride with you to the depot if you want a new town. Mrs. Tully says the cookhouse job is yours if you stay. Sheriff Bell says he can write a character letter either way. Maggie looked toward the open door, where evening light fell across the yard and the repaired back step. Ranch hands were washing at the pump. Mrs. Tully was scolding someone for tracking dust too close to the kitchen. The lantern Eli had hung burned beside the path, not because anyone had asked, but because he had noticed darkness and fixed it. Maggie placed the coins back into the envelope. I am staying, she said. Eli went still. Maggie turned to him fully. Not because I am afraid to leave. Not because you brought me here. Not because the Red Lantern is closed or because Victor lost his hold. I am staying because I like the way my name looks in a ledger I can read. I like honest wages. I like feeding people who say thank you without making it a debt. I like the road from the kitchen to the porch when the lantern is lit. Her voice softened, but did not weaken. And I like that when you stand near me, I still feel like I belong to myself. Eli removed his black Stetson slowly, the way a man does before something sacred. Mrs. Tully had stepped into the doorway by then, and 2 ranch hands paused near the pump. Mrs. Hensley, who had arrived with a basket of mended towels, looked as though she had planned to witness exactly this. Eli did not seem to mind. I did not close those doors to trap her, he said, his voice carrying across the yard. I closed them so no coward could pretend he did not see her. Maggie Bennett is not mine because I stood beside her. She is her own woman. If she chooses this ranch, and if someday she chooses me, I will spend my life being worthy of a choice that free. No one cheered. It would have been too small a sound for what passed through the yard. Mrs. Tully wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron and pretended it was flour. Maggie crossed the cookhouse floor and took Eli's hand because she wanted to, in front of everyone, with no ledger, no debt, and no silence deciding for her. 1 year later, the cookhouse at Carter Ridge Ranch glowed before sunrise long before the rest of the prairie woke. Maggie Carter stood at the long table with a simple wedding ring on her hand, rolling biscuit dough while a pot of coffee steamed beside the stove. Her old valise rested on a shelf near the pantry, not as a thing ready to flee, but as a reminder that she had once carried her whole life in one hand and still found room to build more. Outside, sunrise spread gold over the Texas pasture, touching the porch rail, the water trough, and the lantern hook Eli had never taken down. Widows from town came on Fridays for paid kitchen work. Travelers could buy supper without being cheated. Girls who needed honest wages learned to keep pantry ledgers in their own handwriting, with every coin counted in front of them. Mrs. Hensley took coffee by the stove and judged biscuits, as if the county depended on it. Mrs. Tully taught a young girl to fold dough, while ranch hands came in laughing softly so they would not wake the children sleeping in the spare room after a wagon broke an axle on the east road. Eli stepped through the door with cold air on his coat and warmth in his eyes, hanging his Stetson by the stove before reaching for the coffee Maggie had already poured. He did not need to say she would never stand alone again. The room said it for him: the long table, the clean ledger, the porch light, the open door, the sunrise over pasture, and Maggie's name written at the top of the cookhouse account in her own steady hand.